Hello, my name is Darius McGad-O'Brien, and this is my presentation on the Pentagon Papers. So we'll start things off with what are the Pentagon Papers. The actual title is the Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. And what it is a report that was commissioned by the Secretary of Defense as a history and explanation of the US government's decisions regarding their involvement in Southeast Asia leading up to the Vietnam War and including it. The government had not been fully honest with the American people regarding their actual reasoning for getting involved in Vietnam. And this report, which was strictly confidential, exposed the real reasons that they were there and the long history of political decision-making that had led up to it, going all the way back to the Second World War. The complete report, including all of its supplementary documents, is around 7,000 pages long. Roughly 4,000 pages of that are supplemental to the main meat of it. And of course it was classified as top secret. This was never intended to reach the public in any fashion. Now, as I mentioned, the report was commissioned by the Secretary of Defense, who at the time was a man named Robert McNamara. However, it was actually written by a variety of different authors, one of whom was Daniel Ellsberg, who appears in the picture here. He was a military analyst who worked for the Rand Corporation at the time, which is a think tank of sorts. And over time, as he was working with this sort of stuff, he was becoming disillusioned with the Vietnam War. And he tried to voice his concerns within his own organization and to politicians that he knew. But nobody would really listen to his concerns, he felt. So in 1969, he illicitly copied the entire report and kept a copy of it at his apartment, intending to release it in some fashion in order to raise attention for the issues that he had with the war. And he decided that he would allow a journalist from the New York Times named Neil Sheehan to have a look at them. However, Ellsberg was afraid that he would go to prison if it leaked completely, so he didn't allow Sheehan to copy it, he only let him read over it. But what ended up happening was that Ellsberg went away on vacation, and Sheehan convinced him to leave a key to his apartment with him so he could continue going over the documents. And while Ellsberg was away, Sheehan made another copy of the entire thing and used that in his work at the New York Times, giving it to the editors to begin going over it to figure out how they could publish these documents. Ultimately, the New York Times decided to publish the Pentagon Papers in installments, and they released the first one on June 13th of 1971. And in a departure from the way that newspaper reporting is typically done, they refrained from adding any real reporting into the mix, insisting that every single sentence in the articles had to be directly linked to something that was in the papers themselves. So there was no room for editorializing or anything like that. And that was done both to preserve the integrity of the information and also because the New York Times was already aware that this was extremely risky and they didn't want to put themselves in harm's way any more than they already were just by bringing attention to this document's existence. Now, naturally, it didn't take very long for the government to become aware of what was going on. And by the time the second installment was published, the very next day, the Attorney General ordered them to stop publishing the Pentagon Papers at once, saying that doing so would cause irreparable injury to the defense interests of the United States. But the New York Times refused, so the government sued them and successfully got a temporary injunction placed against the New York Times, which forced them to stop for now. Now, in the absence of the New York Times, their usual rival, the Washington Post, decided that they would take up the series, and they began doing that on June 18th. On the same day, they too were ordered to stop, and they also refused, and the government sued them as well. And the trial that resulted from all of this would prove to be one of the landmark cases on the issue of freedom of the press in America. In the picture you see, of course, President Nixon, who was very displeased with the Pentagon Papers being released. The case ultimately went to the Supreme Court on June 25th of 1971. And the issue at hand, of course, was the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of the press. However, there have been some 20th century legal cases which established precedent to suspend that freedom in certain circumstances. So the court had to decide whether the publication of the Pentagon Papers was dangerous enough to take away the press's freedom in that instance. And in what was a very quick decision for the US Supreme Court, they ruled in favor of the New York Times on June 30th, less than 3 weeks after the initial publication. Now, when we look more specifically at the issue of censorship as it was relevant in this case, what we're talking about is the issue of prior restraint. The term prior restraint refers to a government's right to review works before they are published and to stop their publication if need be. It can be considered as a form of censorship, but it's also sometimes considered as the opposite of censorship, as the term censorship more commonly refers to either editing or banning of works done after publication, whereas prior restraint is strictly before anything is released. In the United States, it's always been generally accepted that the government does not usually have the right to engage in prior restraint. However, they do have that right if they're doing it to prevent a serious national security issue. So the ruling in New York Times versus United States did not actually restrict the government's rights any further than they had been. The court was not ruling on whether the government has a right to do this under specific circumstances. The court was ruling on whether these particular circumstances met the requirements, and they ultimately decided that they did not. There was nothing in the Pentagon Papers that would cause such a threat to the US government that they needed to invoke prior restraint. The most obvious fallout from this case was that the newspapers were allowed to resume publishing the Pentagon Papers, and indeed they did. The New York Times eventually released a full-length book version consisting of the excerpts that they had published, and as many as 15 other newspapers also engaged in publishing the documents eventually. It was an important decision in American legal history because it challenged the government's right to restrict information before it went to press. However, the government really continued to find ways to do this, and still does today, as they so often do with things that they are not allowed to do, finger quotes added at will. President Nixon was outraged at the result, and this was what inspired him to create his team of so-called plumbers, who were tasked with stopping leaks. Members of the plumbers were later involved in the Watergate burglary, which cost Nixon his presidency in the end. However, the story doesn't actually end there. So, of course, President Nixon and his colleagues in the government were not pleased that they had lost the case, and they remained determined to bring somebody to justice somehow. Earlier I mentioned that Mr. Ellsberg was afraid that if he leaked the documents, he would go to prison, and ultimately his fears proved sort of correct, as he was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, as well as for theft and a variety of other charges. He faced a total of 115 years in prison if he was convicted. However, the prosecution suffered from some very serious mishaps involving illegal attempts to dig up dirt on him, one of which being that some members of Nixon's plumbers broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and tried to find his file, hoping that they could use it to discredit him. And the picture on this slide is of the psychiatrist's filing cabinet after they had pried into it. However, they ultimately found nothing in the file that was really useful, so they then went on to wiretap Ellsberg and record his phone conversations illegally. All of this was exposed at the trial, and essentially ruined the case for the prosecution, resulting in all of the charges against Ellsberg being dismissed. The prosecution of Ellsberg was not, strictly speaking, censorship, but it certainly served the purpose of discouraging anyone else from releasing similar information, as if he had been convicted, it would have sent a message to any future whistleblowers that this is what will happen to you. All of that brings us to the Pentagon Papers today. Exactly how Neil Sheehan acquired the Pentagon Papers from Ellsberg was not revealed until this year, actually, as Sheehan died in 2021. He had told the entire story to the New York Times in 2015, but wouldn't allow it to be published until after his death. The Pentagon Papers case has been compared to more recent incidents of leakage, most notably the actions of Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. And in both of those cases, once again, the government went after those individuals with varying degrees of success. But, as with the Pentagon Papers, they were not able to prevent the information from being released. The complete Pentagon Papers were actually declassified and released by the US government in 2011, on the 40th anniversary of their initial leakage. And if you go on the website of the National Archives where you can read them, it's noted that the original leaked documents were incomplete and suffered from many quality issues, in their words. So is the US government still trying in some way to discredit those journalists who released the Pentagon Papers? Have they decided that if they can't censor the press, at least they can stop you from trusting them? I leave you with that thought in conclusion. And by the way, there you can see an actual page from the Pentagon Papers. But don't worry, since it's been declassified, you're allowed to see it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thanks for watching. Here are the sources that I used in creating this presentation. I'll have you know that in the course of recording all the audio for this, I only slipped up and said Panama Papers once. So I'm proud of myself for that one.